Greetings, and welcome to this presentation on transformational servant leadership. As we journey into your leadership related to your management style, let's consider two important leadership theories and the key traits that they represent. This week, we are studying transformational and servant leadership. These two styles have some very important aspects to consider in our business and our management and our leadership. Together, they create a framework for understanding how to adapt our style in two significant areas of management and leadership. This framework is valuable in considering why a team of leaders is important to managing well and why we need to adapt our personalities and our natural style when we are working with others. These two styles of leadership in particular can be applied to help us with these objectives listed on the slide. This session will improve our effectiveness at leading ourselves and others. It will help us distinguish between two important leadership styles of transformational and servant leadership. These two styles are different, and the difference can help us in adapting our own style. This session will help us explore key research. It will also assess our leadership to apply these concepts, and hopefully we will gain new strategies for managing and leading well. Perhaps these examples and these stories will help bring some of the pieces together for us of how transformational and servant leadership can work together or potentially against each other. For example, I have a situation where I was once in a work context where vision was strong and movement was regular. We had strong vision, mission, goals, objectives, and strategic plans. We also had a way to measure it all. But along the way, I began to wonder how to balance all this movement and performance with actually caring for and developing people who are our greatest asset. I watched around me as people burnt out, got sick, or left for a better work environment. So that's one example of how potentially one of these two leadership styles might have been missing from the environment that I was part of and how it negatively affected things. Let me give you another example and set of circumstances. In another situation, I was hired to consult with an organization, a church specifically, to help with a situation where a church board wanted to fire the senior pastor. The board wanted a stronger visionary, and the pastor was a strong shepherd and loved the people well. Yet the pastor lacked the vision that the board was looking for, so they wanted to get rid of him. The pastor admitted to struggling with casting a unified vision, so there was definitely dissension and some silos that were popping up around the church. There were issues of unity because the church really didn't know where it was going. But I wonder, was firing the pastor really the answer? So that's another example of when maybe there was an imbalance between the two leadership styles and they just weren't working well together. There are more stories. Yet these two stories prompted me to wonder about the balance between moving forward with vision and direction and caring for people along the way in our organizations. So as I studied transformational and servant leadership in my doctoral program, I began to wonder if these two theories could explain this balance or imbalance. I also thought I would check into how Jesus balanced vision and care in his management and leadership, and how his leadership might influence us in organizational life. From my experience, it is very difficult to know sometimes when I should approach different situations with care or with direction or vision first. So as I studied deeper, I began to wonder how Jesus led through this tension between casting vision to move people forward and caring for people where they are at. As I studied Jesus, I noticed that he adapted his style depending on the circumstances, or perhaps even better said, depending on where people's hearts were at. So here are some examples. One example is with the way Jesus treated the religious leaders and the Pharisees differently in different contexts. For instance, Jesus welcomed Nicodemus, who was one of the religious leaders, late into the night. Rather than rebuking Nicodemus for hypocrisy and turning him away like he did at other times with the religious leaders, he welcomed him. He talked with him about his questions, and he interacted with him. But then in Matthew 23, we see Jesus teaching the disciples and the crowds how to deal with the Pharisees and deal with them rather harshly. Jesus tells the crowds to do what the Pharisees tell them to do, but don't do what they actually do, for they are hypocrites. So Jesus is harsh with the Pharisees in this passage, and he points out how hypocritical they are. Jesus is not soft with his words. He is direct and to the point. In verse 13 of Matthew 23, Jesus goes on to let the Pharisees know the direction that their hypocritical ways are taking them. Jesus wanted to change the hearts of the Pharisees, and he was straightforward about it. So I see a different tone between how Jesus interacted with Nicodemus as a Pharisee and how he interacted with the group of Pharisees in that Matthew 23 passage. There are other examples. For instance, there's an example with Peter, where Jesus interacts with him differently depending on what's going on in Peter's heart. In Matthew 16:23, Jesus uses vision first as he rebukes Peter for not being in tune with God's vision and direction. Peter's desire was to save Jesus from suffering, and Jesus knows he needs to suffer. But then Jesus is kind, tender, and caring with Peter in John 21, verses 15 to 17. In this passage, Jesus asks Peter if he loves him 3 times, and then Jesus says to him, "Feed my lambs, care for my sheep, and feed my sheep." So we see in that Matthew 16 passage that Jesus first uses vision and challenge with Peter, but then we later see in the John 21 passage that Jesus is tender and caring with Peter. Another set of examples is with the disciples. Jesus washes the feet of the disciples in John 13, verses 1 through 17, which is really an act of tender, loving care and service toward them. But then in Matthew 10, Jesus directs his beloved disciples to go out to share the gospel and heal, and he describes that he is sending them as sheep among wolves. So he is clear about his vision to them to carry on the mission, even though they are vulnerable and potentially in danger. We also see another difference as Jesus interacted with the crowd in different ways. In Matthew 15, verses 29 to 38, rather than starting with teaching the crowd, Jesus began with healing the people who were collecting around him. Then his compassion led him to feed the entire crowd through a miracle. There are other instances where Jesus led with vision first as well. In Luke 4, verses 14 to 30, just after coming out of his testing in the wilderness, Jesus goes immediately to casting vision and teaching about his mission. Depending on the circumstances, Jesus either led first with vision or with care. This explains that it is more of a God-led moment to know whether to lead with one or the other first, and it really depends on the circumstances or where the person's heart is at. So let's go back to the theory and look at the research to see if we might have an individual preference that influences us towards one style more than the other. That way we can enhance our wisdom and discernment as we are making these choices in how to lead in the moment. Let's take a look at the original theory. Transformational and servant leadership have been around for a while. And as we can see here on this slide, Greenleaf proposed servant leadership as having the following characteristics: listening, empathy, healing, awareness, persuasion, conceptualization, foresight, stewardship, commitment to the growth of people, and building community. So in 1977, Greenleaf founded servant leadership to have these characteristics. The early foundation of transformational leadership came about the same time. We see that Burns clarified the transformational leader as a moral and value-centered agent who engages a full person of the follower and changes the follower's self-interests into collective interests through transforming the follower's independent values into more interdependent, higher-order collective values. Transformational leadership was then proposed as having idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. I was concerned that these were mainly being proposed and discussed within secular scholarship and minimally in a Christian context, because I actually saw Jesus living out both of them. So I set out in my research by studying all that I could find about the two leadership styles to come up with these 4 distinctions. They are different at their moral core, in the way that they develop people, what they're focused on, and in the way that they influence others. Within each of these key areas, I came up with 29 individual scales that differentiated between the two styles. These scales were brief descriptions that captured the contrast between the two different styles. And out of the 29 scales that I used, the research showed that there are 5 key scales that define whether one is a transformational or servant leader. These 5 scales will determine 86 to 87% of the time correctly that you prefer either transformational leadership or servant leadership. And there were over 400 people that engaged in the research, so it has strong validity. So let's go ahead and have you assess yourself to see where your preference is for either transformational or servant leadership. It's likely that we have a preference for one or the other. So please take out a piece of paper so that you can track your response here. And let's walk through how to think about each of the questions and what your response is to each one. Again, as we work through these 5 questions, we should be able to find your preference for either transformational or servant leadership. This doesn't mean that you don't do a bit of both. Instead, it means that you have more of a preference towards one or the other. None of us can balance both perfectly because we are human, so finding out our preference will help us to be more conscious of how we are impacting others. It will then help us to choose what is best in a given situation and how to modify our approach. And it will help us to engage with other leaders who may have strengths in other areas that we can utilize as well. Let's go through each of the questions and have you write down your one-word response to each. Let's look at the first question. And as a leader, we're looking at a question of what tends to be more of your moral focus. So if you're to answer this question, that I believe I am a leader that is primarily focused on meeting the needs of the organization first or the individual first. Please think about this question as not having a right or a wrong. It's not better or worse to think about the organizational needs first or the individual needs first. What is your point of preference and reference as you think about meeting the needs of others around you as a leader? Let's go on to question 2, which is a question about the developmental differences between the two leadership styles. How would you answer this question? I believe as a leader that my first inclination is to first lead or to first serve. Now, here's how I'd like you to think about your response there. When we're talking about leadership here, we're thinking about traditional leadership. And traditional leaders tend to cast vision, set direction, set goals, set objectives. That tends to be how we think of leadership traditionally. So this is an important part of leadership. Do you tend to lead first with vision and strategy and goals and direction and guidance? Is that your first tendency as you invest in people in the organization or on the team? Or do you tend to serve first? So serving would be coming alongside of individuals with caring, with concern, with listening, with wanting them to feel accepted, with sharing empathy, with empowering them individually. Do you tend to come alongside and serve people first in those ways, through those more tender, caring approaches, more individual autonomy? Is that how you tend to develop people? What would you write down there? Would you write down that you tend to lead first, or would you tend to serve first? The third question has to do with where our focus is as a leader. So how would you answer this question? I believe as a leader that my first allegiance and focus is primarily toward the organization or the individual. As you are leading, as you are managing, do you tend to think about the whole first, the whole group, the whole team, the whole organization? Or do you tend to think about and be focused on the individual members first? Where is your point of preference in your focus? So write down either organization or individual. Let's now go to the fourth question on influence. So how would you answer this one? I believe as a leader that I influence others through more customary or more unconventional means. Let me define those two terms for you. Customary in this context is influencing people through charisma, through inspiration. That tends to be how we as leaders have customarily influenced people. The unconventional means is a way of influencing people through serving their needs or for caring for their needs. Two very different approaches. Again, neither one is right or wrong. It's just more of your natural tendency and natural style. So would you say you tend to influence through more customary, inspiration, charisma, vision, or do you tend to influence through more unconventional means of serving and caring and coming alongside of people? And the fifth one is on influence. I believe as a leader that my attempts to influence or persuade others come off as more controlling or freeing. Let me help you think about this question a little bit more. When we talk about the word control here, this is actually a good term. Control in this context means that we are trying to influence people through working together, through being collaborative, and being aligned together. So it's a good type of control. And I want you to think of control in this context that way, as a good thing. The freeing means that we tend to influence people through more autonomy, through more empowerment, through helping them find more of their purpose and who they are as an individual. So would you say that you more naturally tend to influence people through helping them become aligned and collaborative, which would be a more controlling way of influencing? Or do you tend to influence people by helping them become more autonomous and free and find their own individual purpose, which would be more of a freeing way? Write down either controlling or freeing as your answer to your preference. You have answered all 5 questions, so we should be able to add that up and find that you prefer one style more than the other. Take a moment to look at your responses, and if you answered organization, lead, organization, customary, or controlling, then you were answering towards transformational leadership. If you answered individual, serve, individual, unconventional, and freeing, then you were answering more towards servant leadership. So go ahead and take a moment to tabulate your responses and find out what your preference is. Your preference would be either 3 of 5 or 4 of 5, or you might even have a strong preference and all 5 are in one area. So what is your preference? Again, we're looking for preference. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have attributes of the other style, but we're trying to find what our preference is so we know what our tendencies are so that we can understand more of our impact as leaders and managers. I actually went into the research thinking that servant leadership was the better leadership style. And as I went through it, I realized that both are actually valuable. Transformational and servant leadership are very valuable. And I actually found out that I was more of a transformational leader. So this has really helped me because it's helped me mature more as a leader by realizing the extent to which I love vision and I love inspiration. But then I also realize that sometimes I have to tone some of that down or calm some of that down a bit because people around me may need care first. They may need my service toward them first. They may need my tenderness and acceptance of them first. And so I've learned how to be a little bit more balanced in my own leadership approach now. So that's a little bit of my story in the process. And I hope that this assessment and a bit of my story helps you as you sort out your own journey here. So consider now your style preference. Be specific in reflecting on some key attributes of your style that would enhance the other style. So that first question for reflection is, what does your style contribute to the other style of leadership? So for instance, if you are a transformational leader, what does that style then help contribute to servant leadership? For instance, I mentioned that I have a real passion for vision and inspiration. Well, that's a piece of what I can bring to the table to the servant leaders around me. Can you think of a situation where you have acted from your preferred style and brought valuable insights to someone who prefers the other style? As a transformational leader, can you think of situations where you have brought valuable insights to other servant leaders? And vice versa. If you prefer the servant leader style, what is it that you contribute out of your strengths to the transformational leadership style? For instance, as a servant leader, you are really tuned in to individuals around you, and you notice when they need care and they need appreciation or they need acceptance or empowerment. So you're really tuned in, and your in-tuneness can really be a great strength to bring to those transformational leaders who are thinking about the whole picture, and they might be missing those individual needs. So that's maybe an example of something that you might be bringing to the transformational leader because of your servant leader strengths. Now let's consider the other view of the question. What can the other style contribute to your leadership? So now transformational leaders, think about, what are some of, our weaknesses, and what can the servant leaders contribute to our style that we need to help balance us out and be more of a positive impact to others around us. Also, servant leaders, let's think about what is it that transformational leadership can contribute to our leadership style. How can transformational leaders help us be better and maybe meet the needs of a larger group and be a little bit more balanced in our leadership style? Can you think of a situation where you have acted from your preferred style and someone who prefers the other style actually helped you to think and lead more effectively? So these are some great questions to consider as you process your preferred style and how to interact with leaders who have the other style. Now let's turn our sights toward the organization and benefits to it as we manage these two leadership preferences. First, consider the benefits to the organization, including the individuals involved, if we find organizational balance between vision or challenging people to move forward together, as well as caring for them. What would our organizations be like if we balance challenging people and caring for them well? That would mean focusing on both the whole of the organization and the individual need. consider the balance as we reflect on the other aspects too. What if we're both developing people as leaders, but developing them in their service? So we're developing them in their ability to have vision and inspire, but we're also developing them in their ability to care for other people. And what if we're developing people with both loyalty to the whole organization, but also the individuals in the organization? Where we're capturing both the whole of the group, but we're also capturing those individual needs and showing loyalty and care and priority to both. What would our organizations look like if we influence people through both charisma and service? So we influence people through our inspiration, but we also influence them by coming alongside of them and caring for them and supporting them along the way. What if we influence people through both collaborative control, so there's unity and oneness and alignment together, but we also influence people through giving them a level of autonomy and freedom. So we've got both going on in our organizations to some level. It's not that every organization has to look at equal levels of all of these, but what if our organizations at some level are considering both sides of these 5 key areas and trying to find some level of balance between the two? Not that both are equal, but there's just a level of consideration of both sides of each of these 5. Think about that and think about what comes to mind for you related to your organization as you consider giving balance to both of these sides of these 5 areas within your own organization. As we close here, I'd like to invite you to consider these questions in your next steps. First is, what practical ways can you apply this information to your management and leadership? And 2 is, what can you do to support your organization in finding greater balance? And I'd like to invite you, if you'd like further information on transformational servant leadership, to visit my website at JeanineParolini.com, and feel free to take a look at my book entitled Transformational Servant Leadership. Thank you so much for engaging in this session. I pray for God to lead and guide you in understanding your leadership preference, and then how to adapt your style as needed in the situations you face. I also pray for God to help you grow your network of management and leadership support to enhance your leadership effectiveness. And I pray for God to utilize your influence in helping your organization find a greater balance between care and vision to keep the organization moving forward while effectively caring for all of its organizational members. Please take this forward to enhance the management and leadership of our organizations. Thank you.